Hi everyone. In this video we're going to take a quick look at performing a chi-square goodness of fit test in SPSS. I have the MT-CARS dataset open once again. There's a link in the description below if you'd like to download the data to follow along. And for a goodness of fit test, the variable in this dataset that makes the most sense to use for this test is the cylinders variable, where we have 4, 6, and 8 cylinder cars, so it's 3 different groups based on cylinder. And the hypothesis that I want to test is this. I want to test whether or not these specified proportions for each of the 3 groups are equal to these values. So in the null hypothesis, I have that 50% of the cars are 4-cylinder, 30% of the cars are 6-cylinder, and that 20% of the cars are 8-cylinder. So the alternative hypothesis then for this test, always at least one inequality. So these are the 3 values that I want to test. 50%, 30%, and 20%, the values in the null hypothesis. So we'll need those when we do the test. Okay, so to get these results in SPSS, there's actually a couple different ways to do that. And first I'm going to show you the way that I recommend, the way that I would prefer when I'm doing this test. And that's by going to Analyze, Nonparametric Tests, Legacy Dialogues, and then the very first option under Legacy Dialogues, we have chi-square. So we're going to click that. That'll lead us here. We have our list of variables on the left. We have to pick the variable we want to test and send it over to the right to test variable box. So we're testing number of cylinders. I'm going to select that, send it over here. The other thing we need to do is down in this bottom right box, we have to enter in our expected values. And this is just going to depend on what your null hypothesis is. If the null hypothesis is each of your groups are equal in terms of they have the same proportion, then you can leave this as is. You leave this radio button checked as all categories equal. For the test that I want to do, however, all of my groups have different proportions, so I have to enter those values in manually. So I'm clicking the values radio button, and I have to enter in those 3 numbers from the null hypothesis. So the first group had 50%, so 0.5, and I click add. The second group was 30%, so 0.3, click add. The final group was 20%, so 0.2, click add. So these 3 numbers, again, are the values from the null hypothesis. Alternatively, you could actually enter in the expected counts. That does require one extra step of work, so I prefer to just enter in those numbers from the null hypothesis. Okay, so now I'm ready to go to get the output for the test that I'm doing, and we can just click OK, and that'll take us to the output viewer. And we can see that we get 2 tables of output for this particular test result, and the first table gives us the observed counts in the first column, expected counts in the second column, and the third column are the residuals, which basically this is the observed minus the expected. The second table is where we have our actual test statistic, p-value, those things. We can see the test statistic right here in the chi-square row, degrees of freedom below that, and then finally the p-value. SPSS also gives us some information about whether or not our assumption about the expected cell frequencies being at least 5, it gives us some information to evaluate that assumption as well. All right. So there's the output for the goodness of fit test using the procedure that I prefer to use. Next, we'll take a look at the alternative approach for getting this output. So I'm going to go to Analyze, Nonparametric Tests, and then go to One Sample. So the first option there under Nonparametric Tests. So clicking that takes us here. And this is a part of SPSS's kind of automatic hypothesis test generation procedure, which is kind of why I don't recommend doing this. I prefer to specifically think about and identify the specifics of the test that we're looking at. Anyway, so first thing I'm going to do is click the Fields tab, because by default SPSS is going to try and get hypothesis tests for all of the variables in the dataset. And I don't want to clutter up my results, so I'm going to only look at number of cylinders. So that means miles per gallon, we're going to send that back over here to the left. All these variables, again, that are not number of cylinders, I send them back to the left. I only want number of cylinders to be in the test field because that's the only variable that I want to test. Otherwise, SPSS would test all of these variables or try to test all of these variables, and I don't want it to do that. So the other thing I want to do is click the Settings tab, and I have to click Customize Tests. Because again, I don't want SPSS to automatically choose the test based on the data because it doesn't know what the best test necessarily is for what I'm trying to do. So I'm clicking Customize Tests, and then the second option right here, compare observed probabilities to hypothesized, and then we see in parentheses chi-square. So this is the test we want, chi-square test. So I click on Options, and I need to click on Options to make sure that my probabilities from the null hypothesis are correct. And again, if I wanted to test that each group has the same probability, I would leave that as is. All categories have equal probability. But my null hypothesis, each group has a different probability, so I have to click Customize Expected Probability. Now I need to enter in the category and then the value from the null hypothesis for that category. So I have to do this 3 times because I have 3 different categories. So first is the 4-cylinder, and I'm entering 4 because that's how it's entered in the data set. And then relative frequency, 0.5 was the number from the null hypothesis for the 4-cylinder, so I have 0.5 there. Next category is the 6-cylinder. In the null hypothesis, we have 0.3 as the proportion for the 6-cylinder. Finally, the 8-cylinder, so entering 8 for the category, and then 0.2 was the relative frequency for that group. So I've entered in those numbers from the null hypothesis. Click OK. Now we could go ahead and get our results by clicking Run. One other thing I do want to point out is the test options area right over here on the left, because one thing this output will do is automatically tell us if we reject the null hypothesis, and that is based on the significance level, and SPSS by default is using the 5% significance level. So if that's the alpha level you want to use, you can leave that as is, but if you want to change that, you would do that in the test options area right here. Okay. So now I'm ready to run, and we will get our output here in a second. All right, here it comes. So here we see the results, summary results for hypothesis tests. It tells us what we tested, what test it used. Here's our p-value, 0.004, which is the same p-value we got using the other approach. And so it tells us reject the null hypothesis. Also tells us what our significance level is there. If we want to actually get the test statistic, we can double click on our output here, and it opens up the model viewer. And here we can see we have a table that has the test statistic, 11.292 again, degrees of freedom p-value, and up here on this bar chart we can get the observed and then the expected values here for each of our groups. So observed in blue, expected in green, and we can hover over and find those values for each of our groups if we want to know those numbers. All right, so that concludes our quick look at performing a chi-square goodness of fit test in SPSS. I hope that was helpful. Thanks for watching.